Right, hello and welcome. So my name is David Levene. I'm the chair of the Classics Department at New York University, and it's my very great pleasure today to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. Now, let's say this series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I particularly like to thank Matthew Santarocco and, of course, Anna Donch for their support in imagining and bringing the series to life. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD candidates, and we're particularly excited to engage with approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. Now, in this video today, we will hear from, and I'm going to be speaking to Maya Chakravorty. Maya is a PhD candidate at Boston University in the Department of Classical Studies, where she is working with James Usen on a dissertation entitled Kinship, Republican Statesmen, and Virtus in Roman Imperial Literature. Prior to coming to Boston University, she graduated in 2014 from the University of Toronto with a BA in Classics and Classical Civilizations. And her interests extend pretty widely. Apart from the very specific area of her dissertation, she is interested in archaic and imperial Latin literature, in Latin prose, in Roman historiography, in cultural history, exemplarity, and ancient education. And her dissertation is coming to its conclusion. She is scheduled to defend it this coming spring. So I'm very pleased to introduce Maya Chakravorty. Please do give your presentation.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. First of all, I'd also like to thank the NYU Center for Ancient Studies Emerging Scholars Series for having me. And of course, you, Professor Levene, for sitting down and speaking with me today. Today I will be focusing on my dissertation, which, as Professor Levene pointed out, will be finished this spring. And I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the project and then move on to some specific examples. So broadly, my thesis examines the transmission of virtues and the conceptualization of Republican heroes in Imperial Roman ethical discourse. And I'm going to just pull up here my PowerPoint because I do have some handouts for you. So let's see. There we go. Right. So I focus on the works of Silius Italicus, Juvenal, Plutarch, and Quintilian, and all of whom grapple with the idea of virtues as hereditary traits in aristocratic families. I argue that these texts presuppose two different but interlocking modes of transmitting character traits, educational and genetic. The transmission of ancestral virtutes via education involves family members being taught about their ancestors' admirable accomplishments and qualities, as well as how best to mimic and reproduce them. This, of course, inextricably ties in with the concept of exemplarity and its influence on Roman morality. Rebecca Langlands focuses on this concept in her 2018 monograph, Exemplary Ethics in Ancient Rome. She argues that exemplar were a force in everyday life, not just in rhetoric and literature. Furthermore, they are ambiguous, containing numerous and at times conflicting moral lessons, which in turn prompt moral reflection. Langlands also explores a process of learning from exemplar: admiration, comparison, rivalry, modeling, cognition, and discernment. Matthew Roller, in Models from the Past in Roman Culture, also published in 2018, provides a slightly different cycle. And this is of 4 operations, he terms it, and present in Roman exemplar: action, evaluation, commemoration, and norm setting. He adds that there are 3 cultural dimensions found behind exemplar: persuasive rhetoric, Roman moral discourse, and historical consciousness. Now, these frameworks aren't set in stone, and Roller argues that there are numerous factors at play, such as fictional and negative exemplar, as well as the idea that different individuals will manipulate both positive and negative exemplar to justify their own actions or indeed condemn those of others. So in my research, I'm expanding upon Langland's claim that the Roman exemplar is, quote, a medium for communicating not only moral values, but also ethical issues and debates, end quote. These exemplar form a critical part of what I term educational transmission, the idea that Roman aristocratic virtutes are passed down through teaching, similar to the processes which I've just outlined in Langlands and Roller. I also examine the role of exemplar in genetic transmission, and this is another term which I've coined really to refer to the Roman belief that different family members shared certain traits. And you can see this in A. The Roman use of imagenes, where the masks of ancestors were hung in the atrium and worn by actors during festivals, is a great illustration of this principle. When these paid actors donned the imago, this lengthy genealogy of ancestors came to life, serving as an inspiration for succeeding generations. Furthermore, this biological bond between relatives allowed families to preserve and replicate prized qualities. Suzanne Dixon explains that one of the functions fulfilled by Roman children was continuity from one generation to another. It is this sharing of physical and behavioral traits as kind of this powerful guarantor of life and memory, even for those who had been dead for years. The scholars Henriette van der Blom, Alison Cooley, and Susan Troggiari all note this biological connection with his heroic and esteemed ancestors inspired their descendants to emulate and replicate their deeds and mannerisms. And while this mode of behavior has been explored in Ciceronian and Augustan literature, there's been less focus on its appearance in the later empire or later imperial literature, which is the focus of my dissertation. All right, so what I'd like to do now is show these two modes of transmission at play. That is, give you a couple of case studies from Juvenal's second satire, and that's the basis of my most recent chapter. Now, I'm certainly not the first to note Juvenal's interest in morality and ethics or how they pertain to imperial Romanitas. Many scholars have coupled Juvenal's despair at living in a time of moral decline with his famous indignatio. However, there's certainly still more to add to this conversation. Juvenal's often characterized as this grouchy and conservative aristocrat whose indignatio seemingly stems from perceived violations of traditional Roman mores. Unfortunately, this has led to the creation of an overly simplistic binary, equating nostalgia with the Republic and pessimism with the Empire, which you can see here on this slide. On the other hand, Martin Winkler has argued that Juvenal is more critical of Republican exemplar, and I'm going to share here his most salient points. Now, his characterization of Republican ideals as trite and cliché highlights their repetitious nature, which we must remember is framed within this context of exemplarity and morality. I argue that such repetition sheds light on the tensions between these two modes of transmission in the Juvenalian corpus, because it is a crucial part of the exemplary process, as outlined by Matthew Roller. Now, this preoccupation with the exemplary process, and in particular the emphasis on repetition, unites the Republic and Empire as a common target in Juvenalian satire. However, this then traps the reader in a paradox, because the value of exemplar derives from their repetition. So the examples I've drawn from Satire 2 demonstrate that in Juvenal's distorted and hyperbolic world, this obsession with continuity has several consequences, all of which I argue contribute to the anger and indignatio found in Juvenal. So I'll begin with an example of genetic transmission because it can actually be found in the opening lines of Satire 2. So the poem opens with this bizarre description of these plaster busts found in the home of those who feign stoic morality. Until the busts are identified as Greek philosophers, I argue that Juvenal is satirizing the traditional institution of the imagenes, a representation of genetic transmission. Harriet Flower's observation that early imperial imagenes took the form not of busts, but rather wax masks, I think strengthens this point. So this is a satirical text, and the plaster busts collected by these aristocratic Roman men represent a parodic inversion of the objects which should be in their atria, i.e. these wax imagenes. We don't learn why the narrator is intent on fleeing Rome until the second line, and I've highlighted all of the key lines for you on each slide. The Latin here is elliptical, all the reader learns is that someone is daring to do something pertaining to traditions or morals. The subject of the verb audent in line 2, in the second line, is unidentified, and Juvenal doesn't even provide a complementary infinitive. Thus far, it's unsure as to what the subject is actually going to do in relation to these moribus, these traditions or these customs. In the third line, we are given a subject, the plural masculine relative pronoun qui. Even then, there's still no specific identifying information. Because audent is in the indicative mood, Juvenal is likely referring to a specific group of people, rather than those in a relative clause of characteristic. At last, we learn that these people are the ones who imitate the Curii and live a bacchanalian lifestyle. Now, the Curii immediately recalls one of the Republic's most beloved statesmen, Manius Curius Dentatus, and by far the most prominent member of his gains, of his family. John Ferguson observes that Dentatus, quote, became the type of old Roman virtus, largely through the admiration of Cato the Elder, unquote. Because, as John Henderson has observed, none of the other Curii are particularly well known, and that the family had all but died out by this point, both Edward Courtney as well as John Ferguson note that Curii, in the third line here, is a non-specific plural, meaning something along the lines of people like Curius. If Juvenal is hinting at the Imagenes, it's humorous that our subjects are imitating men like Curius. While imitating the exemplar of famous men was encouraged, the tradition of the Imagenes is closely intertwined with one specific family. Simulent, I think, is also a noteworthy word choice in this context. While it means to imitate, it does have this sense of disingenuity to it as well. An individual who simulat is one who represents a thing as being which has no existence. It feigns a thing to be what it is not. And so again, we're faced with the subversion of expectations regarding not only exemplarity, but genetic transmission as well. Not only are these statesmen playing at imitating great men like Dentatus, but the gens Curia, as I said, would have been near extinct by Juvenal's time. And so any claims of relation to Dentatus or other prominent families would more than likely have been false. The final two words of the line, bacchanalia vivunt, add another layer to this sham. In staunchly conservative Rome, the colourful and sexual Bacchic rites stand in stark contrast to Dentatus. And I've given you some sources that talk about the rustic, simple nature of Dentatus. So imitating Curius, therefore, is a facade behind which these elites engage in dark and debauched behaviour, which is yet another indicator of the distance between the Republic and Juvenal's time. Returning back to these opening lines, Juvenal then offers more descriptors of these individuals. He describes them as indocti. And it's not that these men are of limited intelligence, i.e. stultus. I think rather that indocti indicates that they are untaught and uneducated, they're unlearned. As Juvenal's pessimism from Satire 1 indicates, the exemplary cycle has become stale. People are repeating things over and over again, and as is implied with these indocti men, without any critical thought or understanding behind what they are doing. Furthermore, recalling that the word imago signals this idea of a wax mask strengthens Juvenal's apparent frustration with the same tired cycle of exemplarity. Without the requisite context and education, these traditions become meaningless and also give rise to indocti men who botch these sacrosanct rituals, i.e. a bust. They're worshipping a bust instead of this wax mask. With the enjambed crucipus invenias, in the next line, we learn that the busts are not of Republican family members, but rather Greek Stoic philosophers. And of course, this could not be a less Roman scenario. In replacing the wax imagenes with cluster busts even of Greek philosophers, Juvenal offers a warped version of genetic transmission, where beloved family members have been replaced with Greek philosophers and imitatio is feigned. All right, so on to the next mode of transmission, i.e. educational. As per Langlands and Roller, one should learn both about and from the mores and virtutes featured in these stories. And this is reflected in the really curious story of the Salian priest Gracchus, who marries a trumpeter. By paying a 400,000 sesterces dowry, Gracchus establishes himself as a bride. The name Gracchus, of course, immediately reminds readers of the famous mid-Republican brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Sempronius Gracchus. Despite their reformist politics, as grandsons of Scipio Africanus, they were aristocratic statesmen. Now, Juvenal's Gracchus also hails from an elite background, but it's worth, excuse me, sorry. And it's worth noting that the Gracchi brothers actually appear earlier on in the poem, line 24 to be specific, emphasizing their prominence when this other Gracchus suddenly appears. Now, the status of Gracchus's chosen husband, enjambed in the following line, as well as the ensuing description of the wedding, immediately disabuses the reader of the notion that this Gracchus is worthy of being connected with those famous Gracchi brothers, or indeed of the grand lineage outlined by Juvenal. When Gracchus pays this enormous dowry to a lowly trumpet player, enough for this trumpet player to acquire equestrian status, he inverts both gender roles and class, which would surely have been an affront to conservative Roman sensibilities. It's jarring then when Juvenal whisks his readers back to early Rome, a locus amoenus abounding in traditional mores, virtutes, and Romans. The contrast between the openness of Gracchus's wedding and the secrecy of the Salian rites is striking. Keeping the rites of a religious ceremony secret is risky, especially one which dates back to Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius. Yet despite the odds, this ritual has been preserved for centuries. It's surely depressing for the narrator then to see that the very individual who helps maintain one of Rome's oldest traditions is also responsible for its ongoing moral decline. What place is there for time-honored ritual in a society where one of its priests engages in such hypocritical behavior? Again, Juvenal appears to be questioning the worth and validity of old Roman traditions here in the empire. And we can see this in his use of words like nutantia. While primarily referring to the sacred objects swinging from this thong, the verb nute also has the sense of doubt or hesitation or faithlessness. And so by leaving the sacra nutantia identified, I suggest that Juvenal is also drawing attention to Gracchus's wedding clothes. They too would have been considered sacred objects, particularly the flammeum, if worn by a woman. However, in this case, it's Gracchus who's wearing them, tainting both the institutions of marriagehood and the Salian priesthood. In a similar vein, when Gracchus sweats, sudavit, in the third line, it's because of the weight of the Salian shields. But because Juvenal uses pseudo, this idea of sweating or toiling or laboring hard, basically fatiguing yourself with hard work, when describing an archaic Roman custom, the connection with the exemplary and traditional virtus of labor is easy to make. Cicero uses pseudo in a similar manner in his Procestio. And really, it's the duty of a vir bonus, an exemplary Roman aristocrat, to sweat and work hard. As a Salian priest and an aristocrat, Gracchus is especially accountable to these expectations. And however, once again, though, this a cherished Republican virtus has gone awry in the empire. Although Gracchus is performing the rites of the Salian priesthood, he's also focusing his labor on entering into a morally corrupt marriage, certainly from Juvenal's perspective. The remaining four lines here firmly situates the reader in the idyllic world of early Rome, a landscape which is certainly far better suited to Gracchus, the traditional Salian priest, than the bride of a cornican. Juvenal matches this antiquated landscape with his language. Romulus is called pater urbis, referring to his role as Rome's founder, and his pastoral heritage is reflected in latiis pastoribus, these Latin shepherds, which is also a phrase I think Juvenal's using here to refer to Roman citizens. Similarly, Mars is addressed as Gradius, a name used by the Augustan authors Virgil, Livy, and Ovid in specifically archaic contexts. And then what happens is this picturesque scene is interrupted by a nephas, which in this case is moral decline. If we use the lens of Juvenalian frustration with disingenuous attempts to duplicate Republican values in the empire, things become a little clearer. Gracchus's marriage is only one part of the nephas plaguing the Roman people. The other is the hypocrisy exemplified by his double life. Although an elite member of the Salian priesthood, one of Rome's oldest religious institutions, Gracchus is also marrying a lowly trumpeter. He is only superficially fulfilling the expectations of traditional Republican morality. Juvenal's references to the Salian priesthood, as well as the locus amoenus of early Rome, highlight that Gracchus has learned nothing from the exemplar set for him. The mode of educational transmission has failed. Each exemplum here has become warped and distended. So I'll conclude by saying that this talk is by no means a comprehensive survey of exemplarity in Juvenal satires. However, what I hope to have shown is that nothing in Juvenal is accidental. Every single word and reference warrants a second look. The apparent failure of the genetic and educational modes of transmission within instances of exemplary discourse suggests that it is the preoccupation with exemplarity, and especially the emphasis on repetition, which has made both the Republic and the Empire a common target. More importantly, Juvenal is not satirizing Republican virtues because they do not fit in the Imperial era. Rather, he's attacking an obsession with tradition, repetition, as well as the undeserved status which has been afforded to the Roman traditions of genetic and educational transmission. And as I outlined earlier, it is this obsession with continuity that leads to several consequences. One, complacency and general stupidity, which we kind of see with those worshipping those plaster busts. Then we have hypocrisy and disingenuity, which I think you can see with Gracchus. And finally, a failure to meet the impossible standards set by the exemplary process, and all of which I think contribute to this sense of anger and indignatio found in Juvenal's poetry. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Maya. And as the normal format for this series, I'm going to ask you some questions to expand on and clarify some of the work you've been doing. So the first question I have is a fairly basic one. You focus on 4 authors in rough chronological order: Silius Italicus, Quintilian, Plutarch, and Juvenal, covering between them, say, 60 years of Roman history, 3 Latin, 1 Greek. Why these particular 4 authors? What made you choose those 4?
Right. So really, this entire project began with my interest in Silius Italicus. I've been interested in the Punica, and I've loved it since I was an undergraduate. But really, I've always been intrigued by the way that the Romans mythologized these Republican statesmen, and heroes like Cincinnatus, Dentatus, Camillus, Cato the Elder, etc. And so when rereading the Punica, I was really struck by the presence not only of these kind of famous Romans, but their ancestors and or their descendants. So I kept on seeing these familiar names or these similar names and recognizing that they were in some way related or connected to the early to these Republican heroes. So that started my interest in the project and in Silius. As regards Juvenal, I really loved the graduate courses I took on him, and so I had him in mind when I was thinking of Imperial authors. And when studying Satire 3, I noticed a lot of imagery and references to early Rome, and that all formed the basis of my term paper. And so when it came time to pick another author and to explore these ideas in, I was really struck by Satire 8, which is all about the problems of relying on familial relationships. And what's more, I noticed some similarities with the tensions I had observed in Silius Italicus. Satire 14 is also really important in that again, directly attacks the influence of parents on a child's education. In terms of Plutarch, so he had these biographies which examined different members of the same family. So with the Gracchi, it's not just Tiberius. We have his younger brother Gaius as well. Similarly with Cato, we have Cato the Elder, we have Cato the Younger. And so I was really interested in kind of observing how Plutarch depicted those relationships across the biographies. And then last but not least, Quintilian. So he didn't immediately jump out at me, but I know that he's got this, very strong opinion and attitude when it comes to training the next generation of orators. And it turns out his ideal orator isn't too far off from his definition of the ideal aristocratic statesman. And he's the only one of the four authors, actually, who really seems to shy away from describing familial bonds and relationships at length, right? The treatise very much focuses on the individual. He obviously does have this really heartfelt and emotional tribute to his sons in the preface of book 6. He talks about how wonderful they were, but there's no mention of how they got those traits. He calls their mother excellent. He says she's highly praiseworthy. And he also talks about how his oldest son shows great potential in becoming an orator, but he doesn't highlight where all of that's coming from. So it's this absence of genetic transmission, as well as Quintilian's argument that the winning combination is actually education and innate ability that really interested me.
Good. Because you said sort of Quintilian was the kind of last one. Were there any, as it were, also Rands? Were there any people you thought of and then thought, well, maybe no?
Yes, so Pliny the Younger was also a really big contender, and actually I'm so enamored with him that I'm determined to fit him into the project somehow. And if I push this project further into my first manuscript, which is my hope once I graduate, I'll definitely have a chapter on Pliny the Younger, because he just has some really interesting observations about family. It's in the Panegyricus, it's all about adoption instead, and that's a totally different angle. And I want to revisit Statius's Silvae as well, but I haven't gotten beyond just reading a few articles by Neil Bernstein and some other scholars, so I need to dig into that more.
Good. Thank you. Actually, that segues very nicely into my next question. Your mention of the Panegyricus and the emphasis on Nerva's adoption of Trajan, because the phrase genetic transmission for us really evokes the idea of literally genes, which of course the Romans didn't know about. But the idea, but obviously the Romans knew how could you not, that people inherit stuff from their parents in terms of their birth, but also perhaps in terms of their character as well. But the Romans also had a very strong adoption tradition, which we see in the case of Nerva adopting Trajan. Did the Romans in the period that you're discussing see, do you think, a material difference between cases where people were adopted into a family as against people who were members of the family by birth? I mean, one case that occurs to me from the Republic is the famous case of Scipio Aemilianus, who is a Scipio by adoption, but he's actually the son of another great Roman hero, Aemilius Paulus. So would you like to expand on that idea, sort of genetic transmission? What happens when someone's actually adopted and not genetically related?
Yeah, so I'll start with Juvenal, just because he's very open, in fact, about his distaste for this obsession with blood or biological connections in Satire 8, right? His opening words, quid stemmita faciunt, say it all, right? What's pedigree got to do with it? But he's really referring to this pedigree of these old families. And so in Juvenal's world, this idea of genetic transmission has become this lingering moldy relic of the past. People are too busy looking back that they don't actually focus on what they should be doing in the present, and what they should be looking to in the future is this really disparaging passage about Rubellius Blandus. And he's basically this insufferable braggart who just, the only kind of defining part of his identity is who his family were generations and generations ago. And as Juvenal says, but like, what have you done today to contribute, essentially? And he really makes sure to note that people like the traitors Catiline and Cethegus come from these prominent families, and things didn't work out so well. So certainly in Juvenal, there seems to be this pushback against this form of genetic transmission. And he's very quick to praise these new men like Marius and Cicero. These are men who had no family lineage or connections which could get them ahead in society. They had to work really hard to establish that reputation for themselves. And this seems to be what impresses the narrator most, coming from a humble background and working your way up the ladder. So he doesn't directly mention adoption, but the way he praises new men like Cicero, who kind of break out into high society aristocracy, I'm still kind of working this out with my supervisor, but kind of maybe the idea that this is a metaphorical adoption of sorts, that they're not born into this society, it's that it's their merits that get them their high status. And so they're sort of adopted into high society because of their merit. And this really works in Pliny the Younger as well. In the Panegyricus, he absolutely loves the fact that Nerva picked Trajan based on his merits, based on his potential, based on his innate qualities. And he says, rather than to please a wife, which is kind of the snarky jab at Augustus adopting Tiberius to appease Livia. And so, as I mentioned before with Quintilian, his sons are dead, but he does describe how his eldest son was adopted into a consular family, which obviously would have helped secure his future. We do get a quick hint that he might have inherited his grandfather's eloquence, so from Quintilian's father, but the focus is very much, again, as I said, on the son as an individual rather than the lineage that he's coming from. So we don't get any more detail beyond that. But again, I think this shows an emphasis on the individual rather than the family, which the individual comes from. So there's this real focus on the present and the future rather than clinging to the past. And that seems to kind of align with the attitude towards adoption as well, at least in the authors I've been studying.
Sure. So you mentioned again the Panegyricus. I think it's a great example. It's a good one. It's a really good one to talk about because because this is what Trajan is. The facts of Nerva adopting Trajan is a really important thing. I mean, interestingly, of course, two of your authors are very much Flavian era authors. They are Silius and Quintilian are Flavian era authors. Two of your authors, I mean, well, Plutarch starts a Flavian era author but extends into Trajan. Juvenal is solidly in the Trajanic or indeed Hadrianic period. So you've had in that period, it's only a period of 60 years or so, but you've had a big change in the Principate, because up until the time of Domitian, basically the Principate stays within a family. It stays first within the Julio-Claudians, admittedly not generally, or in fact ever, exact father to son adoption. No biological son succeeds his father in the Julio-Claudian period. But then you have the Flavians, where you do have two biological sons succeeding their father. In between, you do have this rather interesting interlude where you have Galba, and then he tries to adopt Piso, but it doesn't stick, and they're assassinated instead. But do you think that, but within our period, there's a very sharp break, in effectively 96, 97, where suddenly the Principate stops being a kind of inherited thing genetically. It starts being a thing that is passed on precisely through adoption. Do you see in the authors you're dealing with any kind of sense of that change? Either within a single author, perhaps like Plutarch who actually covered the change, or by looking at differences between the authors you're dealing with.
Right, so kind of the Julio-Claudian and Flavian periods, and then the difference between the Nerva, Trajan, Hadrianic eras, if I have that correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll begin with the Flavians, and so for my dissertation, that means Silius Italicus. And so I have two case studies in my chapter. which really shows Silius actually even then playing around with the tradition of family exemplar. So in a nutshell, my answer is yes, you can see a difference. We have the story of Serranus. He's this fictional son of Marcus Atilius Regulus, and it occupies a really large portion of book 6. It's approximately 560 lines, so it's really long. And essentially the story is that Serranus is injured, he's survived the defeat at Lake Trasimene, and he's trying to return home to his mother Marcia. And Maurus, Regulus's kind of trusty attendant and friend in the First Punic War, and he really reminds me of kind of Eumaeus in the Odyssey. He takes on the same role. He accompanies Serranus, and he describes Regulus's heroic accomplishments. And, of course, Regulus is remembered as this Republican hero who, after being captured in Carthage in 256, he's released to negotiate peace terms with Rome. And obviously the terms were unfavorable. He urges the Senate to refuse, and he opts instead to submit to this really torturous and painful death rather than endanger the Roman state. And that's marked as an exemplum of sorts. And so Maurus immediately comments on Serranus's illustrious parentage, intimating that Serranus should follow in the footsteps of his father, Vestigia Sequi. And so Maurus says, well, look, if your dad endured all this pain and hardship, you can too. And it's intimated that that's by virtue of being his son. And so Maurus really paints Regulus as this legendary hero. But what's really interesting in Silius is that we get another interaction with Regulus's memory, and this is Serranus's mother, Regulus's widow Marcia, and she has this totally different reaction when she sees her son. She's just ecstatic that her son is home safe and sound. When we first meet her, Silius describes her as, really made wretched from the grinding poverty of being a widow, which subtly raises the question of whether it's worth having a husband die in battle, having an exemplary husband, or being related to an exemplary hero, right? Regulus dies in this blaze of heroic glory, and she's left penniless with 2 young children to raise. And so when she sees Maurus and Serranus, it's not even subtle. She's very vocal about her relief. It doesn't matter that he didn't die a hero in a hero's death like his father. She says, she basically says, she says, alas, my son, how many times did I beg you to not to bear your father's anger and spirits in the war, and that the sad glory of your warlike father not rouse you to battle. So she doesn't want him to be like her, be like Regulus. So this exemplary process of genetic transmission simply isn't worth it, according to Marcia. So all this to say, the importance of family exemplar is definitely there in Silius, but he turns it on its head a bit, because even where Regulus's heroism is touted by Maurus, and he's held up as the paradigm of the Republican hero, through Marcia, we as the reader kind of get to question whether such sacrifices, exemplary sacrifices for the sake of Rome, are actually worth it. Moving on, I think, to, again, I mentioned Juvenal and Satire 8 and this outright rejection of clinging to one's ancestral legacies. Quintilian is interesting. He's really a beacon of optimism, and that he's not really interested in family legacies or exemplar at all. He really overtly advocates for change and evolution throughout the Institutio Oratoria. He presents imperial oratory as kind of being markedly different to its Republican predecessor, right? The idea of you have to evolve, adapt, and even improve, which collides with the notion of exemplarity. Exemplarity demands this infinite repetition of respective patterns of behavior over and over and over again. So, he's I'm trying not to digress here, but essentially he quotes Cato the Elder twice directly, and really uses Cato as an example of being wary or being cautious about blindly following exemplar. So it's almost as if Quintilian's using Cato to emphasize the idea that not only can things not stay the same, but in fact it's neither ideal or even possible to keep doing the same thing. And like, in terms of family, I think the closest he gets to it is his discussion of Laelia, the daughter of the famous orator Laelius. He uses the verb rededisse as regarding resembling her father when it comes to her eloquentia, her speech. And Virgil uses this word in Book 6 of the Aeneid as well. He uses it when Aeneas is learning about his descendants, the Alban kings. So redo is used there to describe some sort of resemblance between these family members. So it may be that Laelia wasn't just well educated, but maybe she actually inherited some natural talents and ability from her father. Cicero kind of expounds on this in the De Oratora, but Quintilian leaves it at that. It's very vague, as opposed to Cicero, who has her son-in-law Crassus talk about when he heard her voice, it was as if Laelius was in the room. She kind of he says that must have been how her father spoke, as well as her ancestors. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. So can I just finally ask you, what do you see with thinking about contextualizing your work? What do you see as the wider implications of your work for the discipline, either for people who are studying Juvenal, Quintilian, Silius, whoever, or for the study of the period of that 60 years after the fall of the Julio-Claudians, or for the study of exemplarity at Rome? I mean, what do you think? If you were trying to highlight what you think the most important thing is about your work, what would you, for us all, even people who, I mean, I like me, I work on Quintilian, but people who might work on other things, what would you say that would be?
So I'll maybe address the study of exemplarity. So I've really been pulling from Rebecca Langlands, Matthew Roller, who I mentioned in my talk. So I'll begin with them. Langlands, and this is all in reference to her 2018 book, is really interested in the macro level. So essentially how exemplarity is understood at the societal level, the cultural and societal histories, the use of exemplar as a means to inculcate certain cultural norms in all Romans. So she has this example about the hero Valerius Corvinus and how he earns the cognomen Corvinus. And while she recognizes that family names are a really important part of continuity for these families, she really kind of gets excited about the idea that they're a celebration of the contribution of these aristocratic families to the Republic and its history. So you might describe me as operating on the micro level. That is, I'm really focused on the family unit. Most of my questions center on the impact these exemplars have on specific family members, their sense of identity, and the decisions they make. And so, when Langlands talks about Corvinus, she uses it kind of as a form of social capital and the opportunities it presents to advance their family's status. But I would, if I were to study Corvinus, it's very interesting. And she cites as a specific example from Livy, I might have been encouraged to kind of look at how he is encouraged to emulate his ancestor, why the Romans believed he was kind of predisposed to hold certain traits, and how his family education might encourage those traits. So I think that's how I would differ with Langlands, although there's still a lot of her theory and her observations that I build upon. So in terms of Matthew Roller, he too operates at this macro level. He's really interested in this series of exemplary figures from Roman legend and history. He wants to look at the social and ideological and material building blocks out of which these figures are constructed. Whereas, again, I want to go back to how the exemplar relate to the family. And so I'm looking at it from a private level. He looks at it from a public level. And you can see this even in his model of the 4 stages of the exemplary process he gives us: action, evaluation, commemoration, and norm setting. They're all society and community oriented. The exemplum is performed in the public eye. When it comes to the action, when he's describing commemoration, he has this really lengthy list of the forms in which these exemplar documented and commemorated, and a lot of them are actually for the larger society, larger community. He talks about honorific statues, he talks about inscriptions or paintings, buildings like temples or tombs. So that's very much for the public, whereas I want to see again how that interacts with the family dynamics. He does touch upon the idea of genetic transmission. He calls it familial exemplarity, which I really like. And he has this great case study on Appius Claudius Caecus and his descendants, and how all of this is addressed in Ciceronian literature. But he's working kind of on the other side of the coin. It's more about how Cicero uses Appius and his descendants, and his traits to attack Appius's descendants, rather than how Appius's descendants themselves tried to come to terms with his behavior. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, good. Well, I think that brings us nicely to a close. So thank you very much again for participating in this. I think I speak on behalf of myself that I've really greatly enjoyed working with you on it. And I know this will be a splendid contribution to the Emerging Scholars series. And thank also once again to Matthew Santarocco and Anna Donch for facilitating it.
Yes, thank you so very much.